this video, I'll show you how you could set up your own private CocoaPods repo. The primary reason you would choose to set up a private pod repo is that you don't want the public to use your source code, because the code is proprietary or because of some other reasons. The benefit of setting up a repo is that you have full control over your pod. You have control on who can see and integrate your code. It is also up to you which Git repository you want your code will be hosted. This video is divided up into two phases. The first one is setting up your specs repo. Then if you watch until the end, I'll show you and your team how you can use your CocoaPods library. To be able to follow along, you will need your pod and access to a Git repository. You can use GitHub for now unless you have a private Git repository that you could use. In this video, I will not be showing you how to create the pod library. You can watch that on another video that I have on this channel, and I'll leave the link of the tutorial in the description. Now here's the pod library that we are going to use. It is a super simple library with a class and a flower image as a resource. This pod library was already pushed to GitHub and tagged with a version number. Next, we will set up the spec repo. The spec repo is where the pod specs of a pod that describes each pod version is stored. Each pod spec will help CocoaPods to locate the version it needs to clone for your project. The spec repo has a unique structure where pods are organized into hierarchical folders. The top folder is the root. Then the next level is the name of the pod. Inside each pod folder, we have another folder, and the folder is named after the published version. Inside the version folder, it is where the pod spec will live. So each version will have one pod spec that represents a version of the pod. So let's create the entry for this pod library. I'll create the root folder and call it demo pod spec. Inside demo pod specs, I'll create the folder for our pod. I'll name this folder with the same name of the pod we are publishing. In this case, we will call it My CocoaPods Library. Then inside the folder, you will add another folder and name it after the version tags of your pods. Since it is our first time to release the pod, the initial version would be 0.1.0. Then inside this version, we will save the pod spec. Now I'm just going to copy the pod spec from our pod project and save it in the 0.10 folder. I also need to make sure the pod version value in the pod spec matches the containing folder. If you have other pod libraries, just add the same structure with the pod name, version, and pod spec in this repo. Now we need to make sure this spec repo is available to other developers by pushing it to a Git server. I'll open the terminal on this folder. I'll initialize Git on this repo. Then I'll add files. Then we'll set our first commit. And in order for us to push this to a remote server, I'll add the remote. Then finally, do a git push. Okay, we have finished the first half of the demo, and we will now create a project that will use our CocoaPod library. In Xcode, I will create a new iOS project. I'll call this project using private pod. We will need a pod file so that we can tell CocoaPods that we will use a private spec repo and use a specific pod version. I'm just going to view this project in the Finder. Now I'll open the terminal at the root of this project. In the terminal, I'll type pod init and hit return. It should create a pod file for us, and I'm going to open it. In the pod file, I'll set the source to the git URL of the specs repo. By default, we do not declare a source unless we are using a private repo. Since I want to use the pod that I created, I'll enter pod my CocoaPods library, then the version number. That's all we need to do for now. I'm gonna head over to the terminal to install the pod. In the terminal, I'll type pod install verbose. I added verbose so that we can see what is happening during the install phase. Okay, now let's quickly test this pod. The pod library has a flower image that we could print in the iOS project. I'll copy the code from the library demo project, then import the library. I'll now run this project to build and run it. Now you can see the integration of the private CocoaPod we set up earlier is successful. Okay, so how about if there is a bug fix or a new version was released? What should the pod author do? If it's a version change where you have pushed some changes and tagged it with a version number, you will need to add a new PodSpec entry in the spec repo. For example, you released a version that addressed a bug. You might have tagged it 0.1.1. So what you need to do is update the spec repository by creating a new folder with a new version number and an updated PodSpec file that points to the newer version. Let me show you how it's done. In the specs repo, I will copy the older version and use it as a template. I'll rename the folder name to the newer version. Then I'll open the PodSpec to adjust the version number. Then save my changes. Then I make sure that I push this repo to the Git server. Now that we have a new pod version, I can just update my pod file to reflect the newer version. You could optionally indicate in the pod file to install the latest version up to version 0.2 by using the tilde and greater symbols operator instead of manually changing the pod version. If you use that, it will install the latest version before 0.2. Okay, there's so much to learn if you want to master CocoaPods. While I have shown you what you will need to get started in setting up and using your private CocoaPods library. I hope you liked this tutorial, and please support my channel by subscribing and enabling notifications by clicking the bell icon.